I would like to introduce Eric Farm, the moderator of our Greenwood Green Buildings panel. Eric is experienced as a Northwest Region Sustainable Forestry Manager for a prior employee. It positioned him with opportunities to understand and communicate the relevance of greenwood forest certification and what that means to stakeholders, including employees, neighbors, investors, and the public. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Eric, and with a big round of applause.
Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people here that are interested in the conversation about how our forests are and should continue to be part of our healthy and sustainable communities. I'm honored to be here for the second Hagenstein lecture and introduce this very accomplished panel of speakers. Today, Act 1 is again titled Greenwood Green Buildings. We're going to hear from two foresters and an architect and learn how their work intersects with our topic. All three of these women are very accomplished in their fields, and it will be exciting to hear from them their perspective. After I briefly introduce each of them, they'll get a chance to tell you a little bit more about their backgrounds and how forestry and architecture have become more interrelated in the recent years. So with that, let me introduce this fantastic panel. First, we have Nicole Strong. Nicole works as a Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Agent with Oregon State University. She's based in Bend and covers the Deschutes, Crook, Jefferson counties, as well as the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs. In her current job, she gets to interact with a wide range of stakeholders, and I'm looking forward to hearing how her experience as an extension agent and previous work with the Peace Corps has brought people together to find sustainable solutions to our natural resource issues. Next to her, I'd like to introduce Edie Sani. I knew we practiced this before. Hall. Edie earned her master's and PhD from a very prestigious university, the University of Washington. And today, we're very close to the state line, but where I'm from, I live deep in duck country, and so it's always good to have some backup in the room.
Go Huskies!
Edie spent most of her career working in the environmental policy field. She has a broad range of experience with carbon credits, ecosystem services, green building standards, and forest certification. So I'll be interested to hear her thoughts on how forests can help provide for our community's sustainable future. And finally, I'm happy to introduce to you Kristen Slavin. Kristen is the project architect for a very exciting construction project here in Portland. You may have heard of it. It's called Carbon 12. This is the tallest wood building in the United States. I can't wait to hear more about her perspective on the future of high-rise wood buildings and what that means for the people who live and work in them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole and let her give a little background on how she got to be where she is today.
How many of you have heard of extension? The extension. Wow.
Oh boy.
Wow.
Okay,
You knew a lot more than I
orients
did,
us.
or my family did growing up. I was a military brat, so my dad was in the Navy, and my mom was a teacher. And thinking back, what their experiences gave me was a service ethic. They were both serving greater good. And we grew up moving all over the place, but mostly living in big cities. But I always did love getting out in nature, and I really loved animals. So I went to college thinking that I would either become a veterinarian or an aeronautical engineer as a very idealistic young person. But then I took this elective in field ecology and just fell in love with being out there and applying curiosity to the natural world. So I rushed home that holiday break and said, good news, I'm not going to be an engineer, I'm going to be a wildlife biologist. And they were super impressed with that choice, as you can imagine. So I proceeded to wait tables and work in a lab and do a bunch of work to help pay for the rest of my college. And having grown up overseas, I wanted to go back So I started my career as a biologist in Venezuela, in the Orinoco River Basin, doing some really cool work. But I realized there that my favorite part was actually dinners, hanging out with the ranchers and folks talking about their experiences. And I realized that they knew a lot about the land and the birds and how to take care of it. So that led me into the Peace Corps. I served in Guatemala. Any other Peace Corps volunteers? Not yet. And that was a tremendous experience, and I really felt that it was my heart's work to be able to work with people and help them accomplish their goals using tools and resources that I had, which was access to science, and then also you'll notice a little bit of a sense of humor and some empowering tools, because a lot of people, the barriers are emotional or revolve around confidence more than ability. So I also really like hot water and having a refrigerator. So I wanted to keep doing Peace Corps work, but maybe back in my own country where we have our own resource needs. So I came back and went to grad school and gave a talk, which is what you do when you're in grad school. So any students in the room, make sure you talk to the old people at conferences, not just the other students, because that's how I met my future boss, Rick Fletcher, here at Oregon State University, and I've been here ever since, and I love it. It's my home.
Great. Thank you, Nicole.
Awesome. Okay, so I actually, unlike Nicole, I always knew about forestry. I come from a family that has a multi-generational tree farm, but I was the first person and the only person still in my family to actually choose forestry as a career. And it was tough for me in the beginning years because it was really not a path that anyone. I grew up in the Northeast, and it was not a path that anyone else around me knew about. I loved history, and I would write my history projects on the difference between Gifford Pinchot and John Muir and conservation versus preservation. Of course, Gifford Pinchot was my idol, and everybody knows who Gifford Pinchot is since they know Extension, first out of the Forest Service, but no one else really did, but everyone knew who John Muir was. So in college, I majored in environmental biology. And I really wanted to work in forestry, in the forest industry or forest research, doing something. I was able to get a job actually working for International Paper, which at the time was the largest landowner, private landowner in the U.S. And I worked doing wood quality research. They just were able to teach me. I had some basic science skills and was able to teach me on the job. And I really, really loved it and knew that I wanted to pursue forestry in grad school. That was in the Southeast, in southern Georgia, but I knew there were lots of great trees here in the Northwest, and I didn't really know anything about the Northwest other than my boyfriend at the time, now husband, was from Seattle and was working back there. And so I went and got my master's at the University of Washington. And at the time, I thought I would just, if anything else, I would get a business degree as well. I was really interested in sort of the forest management side of things. But this was in the late 90s, and there was all this talk about the Kyoto Protocol and climate change and something about trees being able to sequester carbon, and they didn't really know whether or not you should grow a tree or cut a tree or what it was all about and how do you measure it. And I got really interested in forest carbon accounting, and that led me to something called life cycle assessment, which is how you can measure the environmental impacts of a product or service that you're making. That was taught in the mechanical engineering department, so I was dabbling a little bit there. And as I was getting more and more interested in forest carbon accounting, I realized that accounting is really made of rules, and rules are determined by people, and that involves policy, and that involves thinking about values and what is your goal, what are you trying to accomplish. So I really got interested into policy. So after I decided to continue for a PhD, got my PhD, and I decided that I was interested in policy and have worked until very recently for the last 12 years for Weyerhaeuser doing sustainable forestry research at the state, regional, national, international level. And that now brings me to my passion, which is really about looking at big picture things, about putting pieces together. I worked on a project with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development in terms of looking at how the forestry sector can really solve big picture issues. How do we, as a forestry sector, globally reduce net greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere? And it turns out that we not only need and we not only can use more wood products, use it as a replacement for alternative materials because wood is a renewable resource, but that actually means we can have more forests as well. That gives a value to the forest. So we can have more forest products, more forests, and really transition to a bioeconomy. And that's where my passion is right now.
I'm Kristen Slavin. I'm not a forester. I'm an architect.
We'll allow it.
Thank you. So I don't remember ever not wanting to be an architect. My mom told me that when I was in middle school, I started saying I wanted to be an architect, and here I am. So I guess it worked out. But I don't think, I have no idea what I was thinking in middle school. But the reason I got into architecture is not the same reason that I'm in architecture today, probably. I believe I'm in architecture because I believe that we work and live and play and sleep in buildings for the majority of our lives. And I think that good architecture can make our lives better. So I want to make spaces and places for people better to be in. And that's why I'm in architecture. I did some work here in Portland in a traditional architecture setting where you're kind of siloed into the design of the building, and that's the work that you do. That gave me the realization that I really am interested in all aspects of design and construction, from the beginning, from development, all the way through the end of construction and into leasing and things like that. So at Path Architecture, where I work, we develop, design, and build our own buildings. That's great for me because I get to control the whole process, or at least most of the process, and we get to make decisions for our buildings based on our values and things that we feel passionate about rather than some third party or something that we can't control. So that led us to the Radiator Building, which is a 5-story office building in North Portland up at Vancouver and Fremont, which was completed in, I think, 2014. We moved our office into there. That building, when we first started even thinking about design, we knew sustainability was going to be a huge part of all of our buildings. So the development team took a trip to Seattle to the Bullitt Center to learn about all of the things that they did for sustainability, and they're like the gold standard of sustainability. And the one thing that they took away from that was, it's great to apply technologies to buildings to make them more sustainable. We can add PV arrays to help generate energy for lights and things. We can use energy efficient lights. Better windows, that's all applied technologies to something that is inherently not as sustainable as it could be. So what we want to do is really get to the root of the building, the core of the building, and make the structure itself more sustainable and start from the bottom up and address sustainability in a holistic manner. And we still, put PV panels on our buildings and do, good windows and nice glass. But we are convinced that wood building is the way to go going forward because it's renewable. So that leads us to Carbon 12, which is the project that we're just wrapping up here in about a month, and that's the tallest wood building in the US to date. It'll get surpassed in Portland fairly quickly. There's another project on the books, but what that has showed us is really people enjoy being in wood buildings. I mean, we're in this wood room. It feels great. It's a very human experience to be inside of a wood building. It's more personable than being inside of a concrete box or a gyp box that's wrapped because it's all steel and fire rated. Wood can do a lot of things naturally that connects us back to nature and provides a nicer experience for when we're inside, which is the majority of our lives, and can and can also do great things for sustainability and renewability. So,
Great. Well, thank you. So across Oregon, we have many different types of forests, as most of us in the room know. I'm from North Bend, which is nowhere near Bend, where Nicole's from. It's down near Coos Bay. But Nicole, can you share a little bit of your perspective on what forest stewardship looks like in your part of the state?
Yeah, so in my neck of the woods, we actually have several different forest ecosystems, but we've been focusing a lot on our dry ponderosa pine forests. And for one reason, it's probably what we live next to. It's a lower elevation forest, so the communities of Bend, Primeville, La Pine, Sisters are all right up next to that ponderosa pine forest. And the other reason we're focusing on it right now is it's really deviated from its natural ecology, its structure, and its function. But we know from studying fire scars and the old stumps in old trees throughout the forest is that historically that forest would have burned every 5 to 15 years. But because of past management and 100 years of fire suppression, we now have this really high density of small trees. And so what we're trying to do is thin it or log it, restore it, whatever you want to call it. We're thinning, we're trying to reduce some brush, and then implementing prescribed fire to try to get that forest to be resilient. And so we're not restoring to a past, but we're trying to restore it so that it can be resilient to future conditions. So a changing climate, hotter summers, more drought, more lightning strikes. So that's the kind of work we're trying to do in the name of forest stewardship in Central Oregon.
that ties really well into the work that I'm doing with cross-laminated timber, which, if you don't know what that is, it's basically massive panels of plywood made out of 2x6 material, so kind of dimensional lumber, rather than massive old growth beams and columns. It's stacked, and they're stacked in opposite directions, so they have a lot of inherent strength. And all of that wood is small diameter trees. It is beetle kill lumber. It can be ugly, it can be knotty, it doesn't matter. It all has the same strength capabilities within that species, and we're able to use that instead of basically retain our old growth forest, and instead of kind of logging the stuff that is the most desirable for the forest, we take the stuff that doesn't really want to even be there and use it in a really productive way.
And that's just a good opportunity, because what we're doing with a lot of it now, because we don't have a market, is we're piling it up and then burning it in the winter. Some of it maybe gets used for firewood, a little bit of it goes to post and pole, but a lot of it's getting wasted.
Right.
Yeah, so the theme here is innovation and opportunity. So it's really getting the win-win situation. You can have new markets, new products, and you can also increase the health of the forest.
Yeah.
So Edie, maybe you can expand on that a little bit more. If we want to see more of these wood buildings in our communities, why should we be using the forest in the Pacific Northwest?
Good question. Well, I do have to say, so this is prime saw timber, structural timber growing area. I mean, between the soil and Douglas fir, you have, if someone invented that today, it would be the new thing that everyone would be raving about. So this is where we want to be growing trees and using trees. And the good thing about this is that also provides an economic value to plant trees and to manage the forest and to keep the forest in forest as opposed to in a different land use. So that's really important. But the one thing that everybody also really wants to make sure is that you're managing the forest sustainably. So what are you doing with the other ecosystem services? What are you doing with water and other things? We are really blessed here in the U.S. and in particular in the Northwest, in Oregon and other places where there is a robust set of safeguards in place, and they range from everything from forest practices rules to here in the Northwest and in Oregon, to in other parts where there's no forest practices rules, there are means to have best management practices required to have a fiber supply coming through. So it's really, we should, when we're looking at it in terms of the grand scheme of things, what is happening here in the US versus around the world, we really are in a great position to be growing trees and using our wood.
So we have the safeguards in place to ensure that that wood is created, grown, and harvested responsibly. What's the alternative? Right now, timber is kind of a new thing. The concrete and steel, maybe Kristen or Edie, you can talk a little bit about.
Well, timber's
what
not
the
new.
other
Timber is very old.
Very old.
The way that we're using it now is relatively new, particularly to the US, but cross-laminated timber has been available in Europe and Canada for over 2 decades. We're behind as far as where we're at in timber construction. It's the oldest building material that we've got, and I think that we should learn from our past a little bit with that.
Yeah, and I think if we could add on to it, so obviously, here in the U.S., the single-family homes are built with wood. That's pretty standard. But what we're talking about here, and that's also not true in other parts of the world where you're in brick or concrete or other places. But this is talking about, okay, well, we know we're going to be in a population where there's more urban areas. We're growing up, not necessarily out, and we should be. And what does that mean in terms of using wood? Now we have the opportunity with mass timber to be increasing the use of wood in taller buildings, which does have an inherent better value, not only in terms of the carbon stored in the product, but also it takes a lot less energy to manufacture a mass timber versus concrete or steel.
On top of that, I'll just add, on the energy side, wood is insulative. So as generally as a material, it's not only does it sequester carbon, it takes a lot less carbon to produce, it also helps the energy performance of the building after it's constructed, because there's not as much heat being transferred through wood as there is through steel and concrete. So if you just think about in the winter, it's cold outside and you want it to be warm inside, the less that temperature transfers through, the better for your energy performance of a building.
That's awesome. So it sounds like we've got the perfect building product. Maybe you can tell us about any challenges that you see, in building some of these.
Right now, our biggest challenge is regulation. And so right now, CLT, which cross-laminated timber, is not really in the code. It's so new to the US that it hasn't been tested to US standards. It's been tested to Canadian standards and they use the same building code, but we can get into that later. So it hasn't been tested with US tests. It's not in the building code as kind of a prescriptive path. You can't just point to it and say, that's what I want to do. I want to build out of this material, and you're off and running. You have to basically currently prove out each building on a performance-based kind of engineering and testing approach. So that's definitely the biggest challenge and hurdle, is just we need more US testing and more government regulation that allows this type of material, which is a great material, to be used.
So Nicole, I think as a forester, we know that regulations are also another, can be a challenge for us too. How do you see regulatory either inflexibility or flexibility being something that needs to be part of the future?
Well, I think in forestry we've watched the pendulum swing pretty hard from side to side, and a lot of recent regulations that have been applied were a result of management perhaps losing a bit of the public trust. And it must be really challenging to write a forest policy, I think, because you're trying to encompass you want to be broad-based enough so that it is applied in lots of areas, but then that makes it difficult to incorporate local nuance or local ecology. Our west side coastal forests are so very different than our central Oregon east side forests, just for an example. And
Do you see that in the fire discussion at all?
Definitely in the fire discussion, and then sometimes we have not only a structure, so a lot of trees close together, but we have species that have popped up that weren't there before. So we get grand fir growing in that wouldn't have been there historically because that frequent fire would have killed it. It's not fire resistant the way ponderosa pine is. So we might end up with a bunch of young, so they're not old growth, they're young, maybe 20, 21 inch diameter grand fir circling in up this big dense pocket around this big old growth ponderosa pine. So, which is probably, closer to 50 inches in diameter. And we want to cut those grand fir out because they're taking water and creating a fire hazard. But because there's a diameter limit, that 21 inch rule called the east side screens, it gets really hard to do that work all of a sudden. But I think we're seeing that challenge, and so groups like I participate in 2 forest collaboratives. There's 26 in Oregon, so if you're looking for a way to get involved, that's one. And we're able to make exceptions to some of these rules and write recommendations that meet local needs.
Can you tell us a little bit more about those collaborative? I mean, what is that?
It's a federal mandate to get past the era of litigation of the Forest Service trying to get some sort of work done, and the only tool in the toolbox was to sue if you had issue with the planned action. So now what's happening is we all come to the table together. We have industry, environmental groups, recreation, everyone's at the table, 8 state agencies, governmental, and we all come together, we review the science together, we go out in the field together, and we write down our common ground. Like, what are the things the science says? What are our values? What's important to us? Where's the common ground? And then with these zones of agreement, we write recommendations that we then give to the Forest Service, and they use that in their planning and in implementing action on the ground. It's pretty neat. It takes a really long time. I would say that it's effective, not necessarily efficient. But there are 26 around the state. Most of them are around making recommendations for public land. And so there's a lot of opportunity to have a voice in those decisions.
It sounds like more conversations, right?
Lots of
people talking.
We talk about our feelings all the time.
We won't go there today. Yeah.
I would say that the connection between these two, between the regulations and the testing and trying to deal with the code and also grasping with ways to manage the forest and incorporating new ideas and really trying to innovate. The key to all of this, and I'm going to say it again, the key to all of this is research. And this is a really important thing. And in order to do research, in order to do testing, you need money. Which there's so much opportunity right now, and there's so many incredible things that are going on right now. But the trend in the US is for research dollars to go way down. The US Endowment for Forest Communities just came out with a blue ribbon report on the state of research in the US in the forest sector, and it has dropped by over 35% since the 1960s. So the new products that came out in the 70s, 80s, all of those, and we're coming out with new products now, but we need to do more. We need to have that to really research to halt or continue to increase. And we're also way lagging behind other countries as well. So that's a plug.
Seems important to be able to open up the opportunities. People want to use the wood. They want to use it in new ways, but you got to have that research to be able to do that. So, So I think everybody's here. The big question is, so what? Why should I be excited about green wood, green buildings? And maybe we can kind of go back through why we think that's important.
Again, I think that sustainable building practices are the only way to move forward. We all know that climate change is real. We're not going to stop building, but if we can build out of renewable materials and manage our forests to basically accommodate that kind of renewable material building growth, I think we're going to be far better off than if we continue to use concrete and steel Steel, you have to mine for non-renewable resources. In concrete, there's a sand shortage in the world right now, which is kind of hard to believe, but there's so much concrete being used that we are running low on sand. I don't know how you fix that, other than just stop having people go to the beach. I don't know. But with trees, we can grow them, and we can continue to grow them and replant them, and we're using small trees for this type of material. There's a lot of possibility out there, and they're just really great buildings to be in. So on top of that sustainability argument, there's also just the human argument of being in a great space that connects to nature.
Absolutely.
You know, when I started my career, I wanted to go save the Amazon River dolphin. You know, I wanted to go there and save that. Not very cognizant of everything that was happening right here in my own backyard. And since then, 20-some years later, I really like to think of myself as a YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. You all heard of NIMBYs. I really think we have as global citizens, we have a responsibility to do the best we can and do it using our own resources from here and keeping them here. So I feel really strongly about that, and I'm really excited about these innovations that are happening with cross-laminated timber, because I see opportunities not only to get the work done that needs to be done on our land, but as a way to encourage sustainable workforce and economies in our rural communities. We still see a lot of poverty and unemployment in some of our rural communities in Central and Eastern Oregon, and I think this could be a really cool opportunity. And then that it brings it back to that urban-rural contract, right, where we're grateful for all the products in this. You know, we live in the city and we're grateful for all the farm and forestry products that come from rural communities, and our rural communities are very grateful for all the consumption and cool stuff that happens in art and all the cool stuff that happens out of cities. And we come back to that interrelationship and that gratitude for each other, rather than some of the stuff we see right now in our state. So I think this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think everybody is looking for, we're going to have a future with 9 billion, maybe 10 billion people. We all want a future where we're living well within the limits of the planet. And right now we use up our annual allocation of resources, per se, by August or September every year. So we have a long way to go. The thing that's so exciting to me is that there's so much opportunity in using forests and renewable resources in order to achieve that. Wood is good. People get the wood building side of it. They get that wood is good in a building. They get that it stores carbon and it makes you feel good and that it takes less energy. They understand that. But that also comes to, well, then what does that mean for the forest? Because we also want forests. So if we're using more wood, then clearly we're, diminishing the forest supply. And that is what we're here to sort of say. Actually, it goes hand in hand. You can have more forests and you can have more wood products. And this is a really important thing. So I think it's great. I think we've got a lot of improvement and a lot of opportunity.
Great. Well, we've got a little bit of time left here. I've got some questions out of the audience. So if people have any questions, you can route them through. I think William's running around. We'll bring them up. The first one, we are in Portland. We like our local food. We like our local wine. We like our local beer. How do we know that the wood we're getting is either local or sustainable? And what is sustainable wood?
You want me to take it? Yes. Well, if it's Douglas fir, it's probably from somewhere nearby. And if you're using it in a building material, then you probably are, using local wood. So that's actually you're in a great area in order to do that. Not everyone else can say that. I think we already talked about some of the sustainability aspects. There really are safeguards in place here versus other parts around the world. We haven't talked about certification. Certification is a great thing. It really is intended, it was initially started for places around the world where there were limited or no regulations, to be able to have some sort of assurances on what is coming on to my wood, what is happening on the ground. There's a whole bunch of different nuances associated with certification, and I would love to have a conversation with people afterwards if anyone wants to.
If I could just chime in, there's 2 places where you can actually go. Well, there's more than 2. But in Portland, Sustainable Northwest Wood has a shop, like a store, brick and mortar store, where you can go, you can get live edge wood, you can get juniper boards for your raised garden, and there's always a really cool story about where that wood came from. So it's like the farmer's market of wood. And then the other thing I would recommend checking out is the Build Local Alliance, which is a group of architects, builders, and woodland owners working together to kind of create that direct supply chain. So there's some homework if you're interested in that.
And I'd add in to the group here too that in the United States we have a lot of safeguards in place, and wood from the United States, specifically from the Northwest, has those things built in. The alternative is getting your wood from South America. We get a lot of plywood from South America, and we just don't know all of the what those rules are. We do know what the rules here are, and we have input on those. So I think that's important.
And I will speak from the architecture side. We made sure that all of our wood was SFI certified in the building. So knowing that, okay, we're going to go with wood building, and we understand that comes with a responsibility to make sure that this product was coming from a sustainably managed forest. We made sure that the wood that we were sourcing was sustainable.
And that wood gets a third-party audit, so an auditing company that audits people for all sorts of different industrial processes is going to come make sure that you're following those rules. So that's great. So a question here on cross-laminated layers. What's used to adhere the layers together, and is the material toxic?
Glue. It's a really, really strong glue. I don't know about the actual makeup of the glue, but they've been using it for a really long time. It's just about the same glue as they've been using for glue lamps, which we've had for not ever, but a really long time. It's really strong. It doesn't really off-gas. We had it all in the building. I mean, we get it straight from the manufacturer, and there's not really a smell of glue or anything like that. So that's typically the number one kind of indicator that what you're getting is a little bit, dangerous or undesirable if it starts to really smell, but it does not smell at all. So from that perspective, it seems okay, yeah.
Rick was telling me that plug for the World Forestry Center, they've just put a new display over there. So if you have a chance afterwards or on another day to go through the museum, they've got a whole exhibit on the cross-laminated timber and what mass timber is. So probably be able to answer all the nitty-gritty details over there on what it is. So another question to Kristen. You mentioned Canada has used CLT for several decades. Have they discovered any long-term problems with its use, decay, insects, things
No.
like that?
I mean, it's not used as an external material, so as far as like water and bug intrusion, that's not really as big a concern as if you were using it as a cladding or something like that. But it's not just Canada, it's also Europe, Australia, I believe. Has some, they're even using it in Singapore, which is tropical. So if you can imagine, they have a much larger problem with termites than what we would have here because it's colder here. And they're using it there, and it has not been a problem. So no, it's not really a big deal. We framed the building, both the radiator and carbon 12, in the dead of winter. We have terrible timing, but it rained on those panels for months and months and months. And we just have monitors in the wood that just basically monitor the moisture level at the various layers of the CLT. And as soon as all of the layers got to a point where they won't grow mold, then we can start to cover it up. and then it's at the humidity level that the building is at, which is perfectly fine for wood, and it does not encourage mold growth. It's also really thick, so it would take a really long time to do anything bad.
Can you give everybody an idea of the thickness of a panel?
It varies. It's anywhere from a 3-ply up to, well, as many plies as you want. So if you just imagine 1.5 inches times an odd number of plies. Ours are about 5.5 inches. It's a slightly different layup than the typical layup, but usually it's around 6 3/4 of an inch minimum, and then it goes up to 12 plies, which is like 15 inches or so, 16, 17, however thick you want it, really. And that's just dictated by the spans and vibration.
All right, we're getting lots of questions, so thank you for that, everyone. Next question is, if there's a shift to building with wood instead of other materials, do you think it may be hard to keep up with the needs and forests may start to become depleted? It takes time for trees to grow, and then maybe there's a secondary question there.
I actually have one comment about that.
Oh, okay, go
So Woodworks has a calculator that we put in all of the wood that we use in our building for carbon-12, and it spits out a bunch of numbers about how many, how much carbon you've sequestered, how much carbon you've used, how much time it takes to grow that amount of wood, and it takes the US and Canadian forests 2 minutes to grow the amount of wood that we used in that building. And that's one building, and it took us almost 2 years to build. So,
Yeah, and if I could add to that, there is a lot of forest growth, but there's also a lot of opportunity to be more efficient with it. So, for example, worldwide, half of the harvest globally is for open fire, for fuel wood, essentially for people who are cooking over open fires in communities, which are super inefficient. That's half of all harvest globally, which is an incredibly low-hanging fruit there. There's a lot of opportunity there. The other piece of that is, I mentioned before that the more demand you have for wood, the more forest you have. The U.S. Forest Service, in their most recent assessment, they do predictions of various scenarios, what economic, climate, population, et cetera, and they predict a high forest price, wood forest product price versus a low forest product price. And for the southeastern United States, they only did it by region, but for the southeastern United States, the difference between a high forest product price, which is equivalent to a high demand for wood, and a low forest product price, which is the equivalent for a low demand for wood, was 9 million acres of forest, with the 9 million more acres of forest being associated with a scenario with a high forest product price. So it basically means if you actually are demanding more wood, you're going to actually incent more people to keep their trees or keep their land in forestry or plant more trees. And that is proven across history as well. When you look at every time a new product has come on the market in the Southeast, the harvest has increased and the supply has increased even more.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit difficult to grasp because in Oregon, 70% of our forest is public. Mm-hmm. And so they have a little bit different, but in Pennsylvania, where my family lives, 70% of the forest is private. And they have property taxes to pay, they have upkeep costs, roads costs, and so getting a little bit of income is what might encourage the kids to keep that family forest versus selling it and buying a new boat or something. So just something to keep in mind.
So I can see that you guys are going to be very busy during the break because the questions are coming in. So one of the themes here is along the lines of, what part of CLT, what kind of jobs and dollars is that? Some more, what's its fire rating? What kind of wood is used? Preferred species diameters, things like that. So maybe we can talk a little bit more in general sense. We've only got about 4 or 5 more minutes about what makes a good CLT ply.
Sure. I don't know the answer as far as how many dollars of jobs are created, but I know that there is definitely a lot of work to be had. Not only is it logging and making the 2x4s, it's also putting the panels together and CNCing them out, which is basically computer controlled routing so that you can get all of the connections just right. It's a very precise way of building, actually. And so there's a lot of jobs on that end too, on the technical side of creating this product. As far as what species are good, Doug fir's the best. It's the strongest that is available in the world. So we have the best trees that you could want here in this state and in this region. But they do make CLT panels out of pine, spruce, it can be kind of whatever, but those are the typical species that you see. And it's important to know that each species has a different strength and, well, mostly strength characteristic. So anytime you make a new panel out of a new species, you then have to go test it all because it's a different type of wood and it has different properties. Spruce, pine, fir, spruce, pine, and fir are kind of the typical tested panels that are made. And then as far as fire is concerned, wood burns, especially mass timber, burns at a very, very predictable rate. It's 1.8 inches per hour. So if you are thinking about, okay, well, what's the rating of this panel? If it's 6.5 inches thick and you need a 1 hour fire rating, you just have to make sure that after 1.8 inches of char layer has built up on that wood, you still have structural capacity in the wood to hold up the building with all of the loads associated. So in our building, what we did was we engineered the entire building. We went through, took 1.8 inches out of every piece of exposed wood and then re-engineered it to make sure that what's left after that 1 hour rating or 1 hour fire, or 2 or 3, whatever you need, is sufficient. So it's great because it's predictable.
Kind of ties back to Edie's concept. More research, is going to be helpful to be able to really widely use these products because we've got the raw materials, we have the mills and the technology to do it. It's we're just on such a cutting edge. So with that, I'm going to have to save the rest of these questions. You're going to be able to find all of these ladies during the break. But I want to thank everybody again for Act 1.
Let's give them a big round of applause.